Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Weiler. I'm a professor emeritus at the Peter A. Allard School of Law at UBC, where I taught for many years on faculty. On behalf of my fellow directors of the Anti-Corruption Law Program, that would be John Ritchie, who's online from his new home in Kelowna, Norm Baldwin, who's our moderator today, who you'll hear from, and Dr. Alex Komaroff, over here to my far right, who is co-discussant today with Dr. Ola Chernobyl. So welcome to today's hybrid session. This is the first time we've had an in-person session since before the pandemic. So we're actually all in the same place for the first time, and the rest of you online. So, and we're here at in the boardroom of the International Center for Criminal Law Reform and Criminal Justice. And thanks to President of ICLR, Peter German, and his team, Marcella Chan and Melissa Chan, for making this space available to us. So ICLR is also the home of the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute, VASCI. And together they're one of the three founding partners of the Anti-Corruption Law Program. We're housed here at Allard Hall, which is the home of the Peter A. Allard School of Law, and our thanks to Director of the Center for Business Law, Professor Camden Hutchinson, and Nicole Suderman, who's our crack technical person who makes this happen. And Dr. Carol Liao has been a big supporter of us for years, and who's now in the Center for Climate Justice, who are another enabler for us today. So thank you, Camden, Carol, and Nicole. So the third working partner of the Anti-Corruption Law Program is Transparency International Canada chapter. So we've always been able to rely on for program content advice, recruiting expert speakers, and promoting our events. So many thanks to Executive Director Trevor Loke and his team at TI Canada. And together, through the Anti-Corruption Law Program, this is a collective action. These various organizations, people, experts, work together and combine their resources, their core competencies, to conceive, organize, host, and archive for future and easy access. These top quality continuing professional education programs. So now in 2024, we're nearing 60 of these program events that we've had since we started off, back in 2016. So thank you to all these organizations, and the people who are in those organizations, the experts in anti-corruption who have donated their time and effort to teach each other and us and all our registrants, the best practices of fighting corruption. So today's hybrid session is the 10th session in 2024 that's been organized by the Anti-Corruption Law Program. But it's the second in a series on Ukraine. We had one back in June of 2023, where we were looking at that point, and that was organized by Alex Komaroff, where the focus was on what things are being put in place for after the war, for the reconstruction of Ukraine when the war was done. And in those days, we thought it was going to be done by now, but sadly it's not. So, but today, it's a dialogue session on anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine since 2014. And what can Canada learn from that? What are the lessons, in all of the activity that's taking place in Ukraine that Canada can draw from? So we're very privileged to have in our premises today here in Vancouver, two leading scholars, lawyers, commentators, and consultants, on anti-corruption in Ukraine. So welcome to UBC and welcome to the Anti-Corruption Law Program. And thank you in advance for what you've got to share with us. So now just a couple of words about the programming for 2024 for the Anti-Corruption Law Program. First off, we're going to have a mini course, a 4-session weekly mini course on anti-money laundering. And this came out of an 8-session course that we had in February or January, February of this year, but we're compressing it into 4 sessions. And again, the course leader is Jeff Simpson. So this past year was a pilot course. Now, we're having had the feedback from you. We're in a position now to have a different kind of course, more compressed, more focused. Second, and I'm really excited about this, there's going to be a 6-part monthly series starting in January and going through June on safeguarding integrity in sports. And I've been a sports-related scholar and practitioner for most of my life. And so I've been working with experts in different parts of the world, and we're very excited about that series, which will start early in the new year. And the third is a session that we're in the early processes of planning, and that's a series on climate change, preventing corruption and climate change, adaptation and mitigation. And the idea is we're going to be able to pull that off starting in the fall of next year, 2025. And finally, it's my privilege now to turn things over to my friend and colleague and co-director of the ACLP, Norm Baldwin. So Norm's going to act as moderator, today. He's a UBC graduate from the 1970s. He's a leading consultant, both domestic and international, on governance, investigations, risk assessment, risk management, compliance standards, and best practices in anti-corruption. So he's had decades of experience working in Canada, working in Brazil, and working from there in Africa in this field. And he's now CEO of the GRC Vista Risk Consulting. So now to my esteemed colleague and co-director, thank you, Norm, for everything that you do. And now over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Welcome, everybody out there in the internet universe, and to those of us present in the room today. We have, as Joe mentioned, we did have a session on Ukraine a year and a half ago on the reconstruction possibilities for Canadian companies. Things obviously have changed on the ground in Ukraine. So reconstruction is still some ways off, although it is progressing to some extent. But as far as the involvement of Canadian firms and other international firms, still a ways into the future. So I thought today we would take some time and really just learn about Ukraine in general. My colleague here, Alex, who's, as Joe mentioned, is a co-director of the Anti-Corruption Law Program. He and I have been speaking a lot recently just about the level of general knowledge of Ukraine amongst those of us here in the West. And I would have to say, just from my own standpoint, the level is shockingly low. We are informed by what we see on CNN and other news outlets and what we read in the papers, and generally it's fairly limited. And that's what we end up with, is a limited understanding of a country that is huge, both in population and in geographical size and in global importance. And so thankfully we have 2 people here today, born and raised in Ukraine, educated in Ukraine, and now they are international consultants really in the field of educating people about anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine and what we can look forward to in the future. So immediately to my right here is Olga Chernobyl, and she was recently elected to the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists. She is at the University of Ottawa, but she is here in Vancouver to receive this prestigious award. You receive that, is it tomorrow?
Yeah, it's
tomorrow. So congratulations and
you.
welcome to Vancouver. I know it's your first time here. Alex, you're based here. And so that's why we're able to chat personally a lot, but it's great to finally meet you. And I'm really looking forward to all the information that the 2 of you are going to be sharing with our audience here in the room and online today. So I'd just like to mention that today's recording will be available afterwards on the Center for Business Law website, and also on the Anti-Corruption Law Program LinkedIn page, as all our recordings are. So starting off, what we know about Ukraine at the moment is that there's a war going on. But there's so much more that's been happening just in the last, say, 20 years in Ukraine, the last 30 years, really. It's only been independent for the last 32, 33 years. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became an independent state, and it was recognized by the global community as an independent state in 1991. So it's not that long ago. Can each of you just give our audience a bit of just a general overview of the extent of corruption in Ukraine as it existed back at the day of independence and how it's evolved since then? And we can start with Olga.
Thank you very much for hosting me today. It's a great pleasure for me, and thank you for joining today to the webinar. Before answering the question, I would like to say a little bit about my experience in Ukraine. So I'm Ukrainian scholar and lawyer. Since 2020, I am a member of Ukrainian National Bar Association. I have more than 8 years, let's say that, experience in legal practice in Ukraine in different areas of law. Over the past few years, I have been working in the matters related anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, and financing terrorism, also corporate intelligence. So after invasion happened, I had to flee Ukraine because I had concerns about my safety. So somehow I ended up in Canada. I'm really lucky.
How close were you to actual military activity?
Once invasion happened, I was in Kiev. I have a flat in downtown area, but my relatives were in our country house in the Kiev region. So it took me 2 days to get there from Kiev. Usually it takes like 15 minutes by car. Then I ended up in the Kiev region, and it's 10 kilometers away from a Bucha and Hostomel. So I have heard a lot. And once I understood that Russian soldiers is so close, they were around 800 meters from my house. I understood that I had to flee because I had concerns about my safety given my professional experience, right? And given my work. So that's why I fled at the beginning of March. I spent 3 months in Germany, and then I was able, thanks to connection with Transparency International Canada, I was able to find Jennifer Quaid, my current supervisor. She's an amazing supervisor. So together, she brought me to Canada, and she helped me here to establish myself professionally and personally too. I'm really grateful for that. So during the first year, I came to Canada in June 2022, and I began to work at University of Ottawa in July 2022. So first year of my work, mainly I was concentrated to exploring what anti-corruption looks like in Canada. Because back in the day, I just heard Canada is really Canada doesn't have corruption, right?
No, there's none.
So,
there's none.
No corruption. So I had imagination, just corruption in Ukraine, right? So for me, it was kind of exciting to understand what corruption looks like here in Canada. Then during the first year, I was able, together with my supervisor, Jennifer Quaid, to earn funding for next 2 years. And basically, my current project concentrate attention on Ukraine. What corruption looks like before Russian invasion and after Russian invasion. Just because there is a lot of discussion around anti-corruption and corruption in Ukraine. I understand that many people have just imagination and knowledge what corruption looks like in Ukraine. So I decided maybe this project will be useful for international environment to actually understand what corruption looks like in Ukraine. So I'm still in the process to develop a report. I hope next year I will be able to launch it and present some insights on anti-corruption in Ukraine. So coming back to your question. So Ukrainian way to prevent corruption began since Ukraine gained independence in 1991. Unfortunately, due to the fact that Ukraine was a part of Soviet Union for a while, Ukraine inherited economy and business practices and, of course, corruption corruption behavior from Soviet Union. So basically, if we hear that Ukraine is a corrupt country, it's not Ukrainian choice, right? Unfortunately, Ukrainian inherited this corrupt mechanism from Soviet Union. So basically, before 2014, there was some approaches to prevent corruption. Like I would say, not approach, developed some approaches to prevent corruption in Ukraine. Mainly, it was like some legislation. But what I would say, some experts actually mentioning about that period before 2014, they mentioned that anti-corruption legislation and associated documents lacked in thorough analysis of corruption situation. They were not grounded on a fundamental analysis of previous achievements in this domain, nor were they aligned with European anti-corruption standards. Additionally, they did not incorporate the successful practices of foreign nations, resulting in substandard legislation that did not address corruption. In periods of 1998, 2002, and from 2014 till 2013, the government did not address like they had plans, anti-corruption plans, but actually it didn't work. So basically, if you ask experts in Ukraine to say something, what's going on with the corruption from 1991 to 2014 till 2014, they mainly criticize this period, just because there was some activity to prevent corruption, but it didn't result actually to prevent corruption. Yeah, from 2006, basically they started to introduce international standards in legislation, in Ukrainian legislation, but it was so slow. And given a background with the Soviet Union, they, like Ukrainians saw corruption mainly like a solution instead of a problem. For some people, it was lifestyle. And for some people, it was like guaranteed to receive a right because they didn't have a trust to the government system at all. The situation kind of changed since 2014 after Revolution of Dignity. People were tired of corruption. At the same time, they began to recognize that corruption is actually a problem, not a solution.
So you mentioned 2014, and it goes through all of our conversations and a lot of the work that you've said about 2014 was this sort of watershed year in the history of Ukraine. What was the difference between what was going on before 2014 and how did that come about? Why is 2014 in essence this dividing line between what life was like then and now?
Just because Ukraine began to have systemic approach in corruption prevention. First thing, they began to see corruption as a solution. At the same time, people were tired of corruption, and at the same time, we had a President Yanukovych who actually was pro-Russia. So given the fact that Ukrainian people chose European perspective instead Russian, it was kind of like breaking point for history for Ukraine, at the same time anti-corruption. So that's why since then, Ukraine began to implement like a lot of measures in anti-corruption, legislative measures. They created a new legislation on anti-corruption and institutional matters. They created like list of anti-corruption bodies. I'm sure that like Alexander will mention about some of them more specific than I will. So basically, and at the same time, Ukrainian government decided to fight against elites in Ukraine, all of that. So because it's a kind of problem if you want to prevent corruption, because they have really huge influence. Before, let's say before 2022, since invasion, because they lost some type of influence right now. But generally, that the way of preventing corruption, Ukrainian way, began from 2014 because more effective measures were implemented, systemic approach. At the same time, together legislation and institution component of anti-corruption policy began to develop more. Instead, the first period, because during the first period before 2014, they mainly like put attention on legislation framework instead institutional. So that's why it's kind of was, breaking point in
So
anti-corruption.
what did, here in Canada, when we think of corruption, we sort of have this nebulous idea that, oh, there's maybe a politician doing this or a company doing that, but we can't quite put our finger on it. We don't really see it directly. What did corruption look like prior to 2014 in Ukraine? How would you have interacted with it or seen it?
I would say that corruption was like a lifestyle. So, it means that like, oh, people didn't see that they can get like something without bribery, even like, I don't know, like even we yesterday discussed about medical service, right? People didn't see that they can get some medical stuff without corruption, right? And they want quick, right? So that's why corruption made life easier before 2014, because corruption was seen like, oh, it's a solution for many stuff to solve our problems. But from 2014, it's like people see it's like mostly like a problem, and they don't want to have it in their daily life.
Fantastic. So Alex, as I mentioned, Alex is a co-director with me and Joe at the Anti-Corruption Law Program, and I've had the great pleasure to be talking with Alex over the last year or so about just life in Ukraine and what it's like. So Olga gave a pretty good portrayal of what corruption looked like prior to 2014, when people saw it as a solution. Now they're seeing it as a problem. So, and Alex, could you give a little bit of background on yourself, what you're doing with the European Union, and how you are a corruption crime fighter helping out to aid in the improvement of life in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you very much, Norm, and I'm very pleased to be here today. I hold dear special connection with UBC because that's the place where I did my post-grad fellowship back in 2021 under the supervision of Professor Joe Weiler, and I really loved it in Vancouver back then. It's an awesome place. But coming back to your question, what I do now, mainly, I do policy and legal advising for the European Union on one side and for the government of Ukraine on the other side. And what it looks like in practice is the EU sets certain benchmarks on how the fight against corruption should look like. What are the things that needs to be achieved? What are the policies that needs to be in place? And my job is basically help the EU on the one hand understand what are the problems on the ground there. And on the reverse side is to help translate these benchmarks into actual policy choices or certain legal developments, legal decisions that can be applied. Coming back to give a little bit of background, I would just add a couple of strides to what Olga just said, pretty accurate picture of that. I think it is important to understand that the fall of the Soviet Union was probably not seen the same way in post-Soviet countries and in Ukraine as it was seen in the West. While generally in the West, it was considered to be a great geopolitical event, breaking of this geopolitical monster, finally freedom coming to Eastern Europe. To a large extent, post-Soviet countries, not all of them, but significant portion of them looked at this as, well, okay, now we have our own budget. Now we have our own governance structures and ability to exercise more control over this portion of land. But we still continue living in this sort of post-Soviet space. We are not having any radical break with Soviet. And that's how, to a large extent, the idea was sold to people. And that's, I think, why to a large extent, maybe not to a large extent, but at least to some extent, why the collapse of Soviet Union happened that peacefully, because there was no idea of radical break. Well, you can see countries like, say, Poland or Baltic republics that immediately embarked on the Western path, it is not what happened in Ukraine right away. And Ukraine,
And why is that? I mean, they saw what was happening in these other countries who immediately embraced the West and Western cultural values and governance structures, capitalism. Why was Ukraine maybe not quite so fast out of the blocks?
I could give you only my best guess, and it would probably be tied to the fact that Ukraine was under Soviet rule for 70 years. So by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, there was nobody left alive who actually remembered how it was before. While if we are thinking about Poland, if we're even thinking about western part of Ukraine, if we're thinking about Baltic republics, all of them were joined to the Soviet bloc. Poland, I mean, was not a part of Soviet Union, but it was
World War II, basically.
after World War II. So by 1990, by 1991, there were still many people alive who remembered how it was before. And that's unfortunately not what happened in Ukraine. So it took a lot of time to understand where the country is moving. And obviously, when it comes to corruption, Ukraine basically inherited all the patterns that existed in Soviet Union: cronyism, nepotism. In Soviet Union, corruption was terrific, like terrifying, I would say. But it was not that visible because everything was run by the government, right? And now imagine what happens in Ukraine in 1991 after getting the independence. There is a country which has a lot of assets, and they are all state-owned assets. Factories, mines, metallurgy, heavy machinery, and all of that immediately goes up for grabs. The country starts privatization right away because the country needs money. All the economic ties within Soviet republics are broken. So you are thinking, how do you transition to market economy? You start with privatization. What do you do next? You do not allow any foreign capital to come and take a place in this privatization. Because the idea is like, who needs to be owning the factories and all these assets? Those who work there still. So basically what Ukraine does, it divides like these assets into shares and distributes it among workers who are working at these factories. These people have no idea how to live in market economy. They don't know what to do with this piece of paper that they just received, like a share in some company. It doesn't generate income right away, no clue how to generate income out of it. So who takes advantage out of all these processes? These are either so-called group of red directors, previous Soviet managers of these factories and assets who actually had some idea of, okay, this.
At least how to manufacture widgets.
Yes, and the second group is like criminal groups, because criminal groups had some idea of how market economy operates. They operated in the black market during Soviet time, so they understood what is supply, what is demand, what is all behind the things. And they get all these assets, pennies for a dollar, like literally for cheap. And buying off all these shares from workers who have no clue what to do for like extremely low investments. And that's how this class of oligarchy is created.
This is the birth of the oligarchs.
Yes. The thing about Ukraine, what makes it different, say, from other post-Soviet republics, is that in Ukraine, this oligarchy, unlike, say, Russia, was never centralized under the government roof. So what Putin did when he came to power, he sort of said that there can be only one oligarch there in Kremlin, right? And everybody else can operate only as long as you cede to the government and do what the government tells you to do. That was never the case in Ukraine. All these groups that appeared, they were fighting for power, fighting for the hope to make a state capture, but to a large extent of success. And I think the largest success, the closest they came to success was actually when the Yanukovych was elected. So probably if we're talking about 1990s and 2000s, that's a period of trying to understand where the country goes. It's a period of significant economic turnover and trying to adapt to new conditions. And I totally agree, whatever was said about not fighting with corruption, not taking corruption seriously back then, I'd say a significant reason, a significant portion at least of reason for that has to do with the fact that there were way more important things right away on the table, like basic survival and trying to understand how to make it for life in these economic conditions. And handy corruption came into play to be sort of solution to get access to limited services, to limited goods. And that's how from top level, it started spreading down into daily operations. But closer to, after the Yanukovych election, he actually tried to complete a full state capture. And I think the main mistake that he made was that when the peaceful protests erupted in Kiev to join the EU, he used police force and the violence towards protesters, towards absolutely peaceful protesters. And that is not what anybody was tolerant to in Ukraine. And then you had the Revolution of Dignity, Euromaidan, Fight for European Future, basically overthrowing, like changing the government, holding new election and choosing new.
This all happens in around 2014.
And it all happens like in between November 2013 and pretty much end of February 2014. And that's the moment when the reforms start to kick in, because the first Russian invasion starts in 2014. The whole idea of the Revolution of Dignity was very closely tied to the prospect of the European future in the EU. And the newly elected government was pro-Western. But because of the rampant corruption in the government, Ukraine was left pretty much absolutely unprepared for the Russian invasion of 2014. There was not enough military supply of whatsoever kind. So there was no understanding of very poor military command back then. And there was no understanding of actually what was happening back in the moment. So corruption started being seen as a threat to national security. And after signing the association agreement with the EU, anti-corruption policies, and actually corruption was recognized as a key problem of national security, and anti-corruption policies started to be way closer embedded in any kind of reforms. And because the country so severely depended on foreign funding and foreign aid, pretty much each portion of that aid was tied to certain benchmark in fight against corruption. So, okay, you want to sign another memorandum with IMF? Sure, introduce this and this reform. And that's when the EU kicks in and starts playing like a leading role. What I think is interesting about the Ukrainian case, because pretty much since 2014, Ukraine is like this huge playground for all sorts of anti-corruption reforms. And all kinds of experiments to reduce corruption were pretty much implemented there.
But the culture, this is sort of a question for Olga. So at this point, people have seen corruption as being sort of almost a necessary evil, or at least a way to go along and get along. Now we've come to this dividing line where it's like, oh, corruption's bad. You know, let's move into a more positive direction. Was this something that the entire culture just sort of was able to embrace right away, or did that take a long time for people to come around to this way of thinking? That because even if the EU was saying you've got to have anti-corruption measures in place, what were the people of Ukraine saying?
It's interesting question. I would say that people in Ukraine have a different perspective. So on these measures which were implemented in Ukraine since 2014, I think it's a good achievement that people began to recognize that corruption can be a problem, first of all. The other stuff, given a fact that people don't trust government, their trust to the government is still low. So they criticize all measures which were implemented, right? At the same time, Ukrainian society want quick solutions. So corruption, it's not about quick solutions, right? It takes time to implement some measures, right? And see, it worked out or no? What kind of criteria we can choose to understand it was effective or no, right? At the same time, if we're talking about all system anti-corruption system, we can't say, oh, the system is successful because this component is successful. We have to see and analyze all system, right? So that's why, like, I think depends on the area and it depends on its own experience with the corruption inside Ukraine. People see like anti-corruption in Ukraine in a different perspective. Some of them think, oh, corruption still exists. Some of them, we don't want to use corrupt practices anywhere. We will follow it. And other ones still like, oh, does Ukraine improve anti-corruption measures from 2014? So it's kind of like, I think, to answer on your question, it's a personal perspectives and personal experience dealing with the corruption inside Ukraine since 2014.
And I think people will get behind government measures if they start to see results.
It depends what kind of results we can see that the system is effective. Like we had a discussion, if like people see in the media that there are a lot of corrupt cases right now, what does it mean? The system was improved that it able to catch corruption, or there is this corruption. So it's kind of like, and people, some of them would think, yeah, it's a high level of corruption, and we have ongoing war. At the same time, others would say, yeah, it's good. It's actually results. So that's why I think, we can see, to answer these questions, it can be different perspectives to answer based on experience.
And I think people will also, in addition to seeing results, people will get behind the government or maybe even the EU's suggestions. If they see that the governance structure that is being put in place in conjunction with the EU and other Western sources actually makes sense. And Alex, you mentioned that it's sort of been a trial and error. Let's see which works, which doesn't work in Ukraine. So what was the sort of initial approach to post 2014, the initial approach to battling corruption?
Okay, I think that 2014 is a dividing line for multiple reasons. So if you probably ask, 99 out of 100 people in Ukraine, they will tell you that they hate corruption and that's the most important problem that is on the spot. But in 2014, once Yanukovych's government corruption was exposed, it just became the level of damage that it did to people, to the country, to ability to protect itself from external threat was just so obvious to everyone, that there was this momentum to capitalize on reforms. And there was this huge push for, I call it thirst for blood, which means people actually wanted to see corrupt officials being put in jail, thrown in jail in large numbers right away. So rather than thinking, so when Ukraine was...
And did that happen? Did anyone go to jail?
Yes, but
Okay.
Ukraine was considering two kinds of tracks on how to deal with corruption back then, obviously with the assistance of both the US and the EU back then, and Canada also was a part of that discussion, by the way. The first track was, let's do a long-term investments, the rule of law, in systemic reforms, go look into sectors, go look at where the red tape is, what we can cut on. So try to change the enabling environment and kind of do what we generally associate with long-lasting reforms that bring effect. There is one problem with these reforms. They do not satisfy that public thirst for having people,
as Olga mentioned,
put in prisons right away.
Ukrainians are a bit impatient. They want instant results. Yeah.
So there was another approach. And then you have the problem of Ukraine was that the judicial system compromised itself a lot during Yanukovych's time. going all the way up to the Constitutional Court that overruled constitutional amendments to actually increase the power of the president back during his administration. So there was extremely little trust in judicial system. And one solution was to invest in these long-lasting reforms. Another solution was, well, let's do it rough and ready. Let's create a set of specialized institutions to investigate corruption, to prosecute corruption, and then vest into them the power to look into high-level corruption, first of all, and that's how we will get convictions fast. So Ukraine created the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, which is basically a policy-making authority. That's like a more broad approach, but they are typically associated with one of their tools, which is asset declarations. And what it means, every single public official in Ukraine on an annual basis has to submit a declaration declaring all of his income, all the real estate that he has. The same applies both to him and to his relatives.
This is elected officials or all public officials?
It does not matter.
Anybody who works for the government.
So it's like more than 700,000 declarations each year.
Wow.
And then like you get these declarations every year and you can build some record and understand, and then you can verify them against other state registries, say tax registry. You see that the person is declaring this year a purchase of a new fancy house that it costs like, I don't know, $2 million. Imagine a mansion. By Ukrainian standard, it will be a mansion for this money. And then you see that the whole income for the previous year was like 50,000 max, tops. And then like, where does this money come from? That's when we introduced another tool, Unexplained wealth orders. That's been there. It's also been constitutionally litigated, but I think we will come to that way later in the discussion. That's the first agency, National Agency on Corruption Prevention. The second one was National Anti-Corruption Bureau, specific investigative agency to go after like high-level officials. They don't look into petty corruption at all. They go after judges, government officials. There is a enumerated list of positions which fall within their investigative jurisdiction. And another criteria, if the amount of bribe or damage cost is like also high, that's when the NABU can go after and investigate the case.
Right. Can we just explain for our audience, just very briefly, what unexplained wealth orders are? Because they're a new tool here in Canada, and really only British Columbia is sort of leading the way in their creation and implementation. If you've been following in the press, you'll see where there's been maybe 3, I think, recently that have been implemented. But it's a new tool. It's probably going to be constitutionally challenged here in Canada. But can you explain just how it functions in Ukraine?
In Ukraine, it works the way when you like check officials' declaration. The National Agency on Corruption Prevention checks it and sees that there is a huge discrepancy between your income and the legitimate sources of between, say, your spending or like whatever you declare and the legitimate sources of your income. You are being asked to explain this difference.
This is strictly with government officials? Because here in British Columbia, it's all been against private citizens.
No, in Ukraine, it's primarily against officials. No, it's not against private citizens. Then you are asked to explain the difference. And if you fail to do so, then the prosecutor brings a lawsuit to the court alleging that assets were obtained in an unjustified way. And there is always this big discussion whether it violates the presumption of innocence. In Ukraine, it's not being done as a part of criminal proceeding. It's a part of civil proceeding. That's how we kind of lower the burden of proof. It's a part of civil proceeding. So if the assets are not justified, if you are not able to explain them in the court, they may be seized by the government.
Right. So one of the.
In
one of-
parallel,
Yeah,
there
keep
can be
going,
a
keep going.
criminal, sorry, in parallel, there can be a criminal proceeding as well. That's what I wanted to add.
Right, okay. Yeah, one of the subtitles of today's seminar discussion was what Canada can learn from Ukraine. And certainly on the subject of unexplained wealth orders, there's some possibilities there. You mentioned these ownership or asset ownership registries that Ukraine has put into place. We have had a devil of a time here in Canada trying to create and implement beneficial ownership registries on a federal level and on a provincial level. And provincially, if I want to say Alex owns a company in Ontario, and I want to get some information about that company, when it was established, is its registry status active? I can get that for free and I can get it in seconds. I can't get much more information than that unless I'm prepared to pay. And it does take time and they'll send me a record. I may or may not find out who the directors are, and I may or may not find out if they've had any problems with Canada Revenue. Other provinces, British Columbia, are in a similar boat. You do have to pay to get proper information about companies here. You can get free information, but it's very, very limited. And as you go sort of across the country, Alberta is very, very difficult. Quebec, on the other hand, I had the very pleasant experience the other day of having to get information on a company in Quebec. And it was fantastic. It just gave me absolutely everything I could possibly want to know about this company, who the directors were, when they came on board, et cetera, et cetera. It was just terrific. Who the owners were, the actual equity ownership of the company was there, and it was all free and it was all instant. It was wonderful. So as an anti-corruption tool in Canada, I would implore all provincial regulators out there, please improve the beneficial ownership regime here in Canada. Make it free, make it publicly accessible. That's my little beef. In Ukraine, that's the current situation. Is that right, Olga? I could find out any information on pretty much any company?
Yeah, it's easy to find information, but there is also a problem if you can find information, how you will analyze. You have to have a specific knowledge to analyze this information in the proper way and find corruption, right?
Mhm.
But the idea to disclose this information, I agree, it's a very useful tool in a corruption prevention. But in Ukraine, it's kind of very easy to find information on beneficial owner and like connections also. But there is also risks when they disclose this data. You also can see that one person can own 15 organizations. It's like kind of risk for money laundering, right? Why you should have like 15 organizations at the same time, right? You just can add a type of activity you would provide. So, but in general, these tools were improved, significantly improved. But other concerns to have knowledge basically to analyze this. For me, like a lawyer, of course I can check state register. I know where to find, right? I know how to analyze. But at the same time, civil society, right? Given the fact that they have limited resources in Ukraine because they struggle to find funding for their activity. It's kind of like for them challenging also. I know there is some projects in Ukraine to basically provide them some knowledge in financial investigations and some techniques like OSINT. So that's why it's kind of like in a developing stage. But of course, we have some professionals who are able to analyze this data,
right,
and find.
So Ukraine, I guess, is seen in some quarters as this experiment for the West. You know, how can we mold this country into something that we're happy with? And the EU and, well, I won't say NATO, but sort of, NATO countries, Canada, United States, England, they've been sort of using this carrot and stick approach, I guess, with Ukraine. We want anti-corruption measures. We want this, we want that. You mentioned some of the governance structures that were put in place, and I'll ask you to sort of maybe expand on that in terms of, what actual government bodies are now being used to combat corruption, because we've been through this trial and error process. What worked, what didn't work. Now you've come to a situation in Ukraine where it is functioning. This seems to be the model that works. The EU and the West seem to like this model because they fund it. They're or helping to fund it. What metrics are they using to continue the funding and continue logistical support, technical support? Is it just purely based on convictions and prosecutions, or what? I mean, just in your own experience, what have you seen in terms of the efficacy of these government bodies?
I would say that these numerous bodies were created in Ukraine since 2014 to prevent and combat corruption. They have a lot of support from European Union, right, and other donors to provide trainings, provide funding for projects, and improving the qualifications. But at the same time, as I mentioned today, that is very important to support all system and look on all system, right? Because also inside the Ukraine is a discussion. It's mainly they say that anti-corruption bodies is SAP, NABU, and High Anti-Corruption Court of Ukraine, right? But it's also there is a ARMA and also a Bureau of Economic Security instead of agency. So that's why they all participate in combating corruption. And some of them that's struggle with resources. Yeah, not struggle with the resources. They have a different result of their activity, right? Some authorities more effective, other one a bit slow. We're saying that there are a lot of discussions right now of reestablish ARMA. We'll also a lot of discussion about BEP, Bureau of Economic Security. These agencies didn't show the results, the results from High Anti-Corruption Court, SAP, and NABU. So that's why it's kind of it's good that Ukraine has support from international partners. The main point to have this support in a long-term perspective, not just short one, right? So, yeah.
Okay, Alex, do you want to expand on that at all?
Taking us a little bit back again
Okay.
to that conversation. So once again, there were two approaches: broader institutional reforms or creating a set of specialized institutions and going after corruptions to provide convictions, more convictions. So what happened first? Creation of this National Agency on Corruption Prevention to disclose corruption, to prevent, first of all, right, to solve things like conflict of interest, to provide guidance to other agencies on ethical behavior, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and to disclose corruption through verification of this asset declaration. Then we have this National Anti-Corruption Bureau, which is totally investigative agency. Think about it as a FBI or RCMP to some extent, but with a specific focus on looking into high-level corruption. Then we created a specialized prosecutor's office, SAPO, Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, which will be specifically representing the cases investigated by national agencies in courts. And that's where Ukraine stumbled into a problem. You can have all these high-quality investigations being delivered, and then they go down to courts, the very same unreformed courts from previous times, with judges having their tenured position and being marred with corrupt practices in large. And that's why Ukraine had to go even further and create a specialized anti-corruption court to prosecute these cases. And it all took time. Find people, to have selection processes, to provide training to them, to provide sufficient resources. So now, and additionally, obviously, there is a fourth one, which is asset recovery and tracing agencies, the last agency on this list, because there was this realization that, okay, it's good to put people in prison, but it's not enough. You also need to kind of return what was stolen from the state and from the people, right? So we created a separate agency to trace assets globally, not only within Ukraine, but globally, and then initiate the return of assets.
Is that the group you told me a few days ago that Ukraine brought in the FBI to train people?
No, for NABU.
So it's with NABU.
Yeah, for investigation, they were trained.
Okay.
So we have
first phase of things, right? The FBI comes in and they train 800 investigators.
I think that was happening in like 2016, 2017.
yeah.
Once the agency was just created in 2015, like the Anti-Corruption Bureau was created, and then they received a lot of training from all sides. On the EU level as well, mainly they traveled to countries with similar specialized anti-corruption agencies, which in Europe are like Poland. Other post-Soviet countries like Baltics had all of that. They also created a set of specialized anti-corruption institutions because Soviet legacy speaks of itself in certain ways. And yeah, this was all trained. Now it's all is in place. That was the main benchmark. One of the benchmark is obviously, okay, now when we have all of this in place, now when we have the court in place, where all these proceedings are coming, where are convictions? That's why on like the agreement, well, that's why on the requirement that the EU actually delivered for opening negotiations on the US session with Ukraine was to show a track record of high level corruption prosecution. So show that you don't just investigate and it goes to nowhere, but you have like actually people being held liable for what they did. And we do see this only in the last couple of years. We do see that, we do see more verdicts being delivered every year. It's also like the dissatisfaction, a lot of dissatisfaction with the anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine has to do with the fact that people want convictions here and now. You cannot provide that. You still are bound with due process, with the rule of law. It is not that you just bring the case in the court and you have conviction the next day. All these individuals, like who are former, say, ministers, who are former judges, they are able to buy themselves pretty well defense lawyers who know how to make obstacles in proceedings, come up with all kinds of motions, other procedural abuses just to delay the verdict and hope that the statute of limitation will apply. That's another thing that Ukraine had to do, extend statutes of limitation so that nobody goes free. But only now we start seeing that. If you think about that, I wouldn't say that that's a bad result. Simply because the High Anti-Corruption Court finally started functioning in 2019, and it took it some time to get going, like to first investigations were brought. Typically, these are the cases that are not being tried within just.
So what's the difference between high-level corruption that would be dealt with in that judicial regime and corruption which is only, say, handled by the police?
What's
in terms of like when you say high-level corruption, you know, define that versus versus. So the police, for example, aren't going to get involved at that level, only at the lower level if you've got a problem.
We are defining that it's been defined by one of two criteria, either personal criteria, who is a perpetrator, and there is this list of positions. So if since the crime is committed by member of parliament, alleged crime, right? Is committed by the member of parliament, judge, prosecutors of certain level. If we are talking about lower level officials, some bureaucrat who is asking for money to issue a certain certificate or permit on the lower level, it's not a level of government, it's not a level of ministry. That's where the national police looks at. And that's where reform is still pending.
Yeah.
Because all the EU only now I think the EU started actually carefully looking into that lower layer of corruption, what is happening on the level of petty corruption, right? Because now another benchmark and another focus is on the implementation of state anti-corruption strategy, national anti-corruption strategy, and there is a state anti-corruption program, action plan, very detailed action plan, how to cut the red tape in every stage, how to improve this or that regulations, to actually basically limit the enabling environment and limit the opportunities for corrupt practices. One of the solutions that Ukraine is heavily leaning on is so-called digitization of everything. So wherever you can remove direct interaction of a citizen or business with the official, you do that by just having developed applications and enabling you with the ability to receive whatever service or whatever permit just without any kind of direct interaction, just by filling up certain forms.
It's a huge global movement towards smart government where, procurement, for example, you take a lot of potential corruption possibilities right out of the picture because everything is digital. You don't really have the ability to go in and bribe somebody.
Yeah.
For most of public procurement in Ukraine, the system that was developed back, I think, in 2015-16, it's called Prozora, which basically means transparent. It doesn't require any participation of the official in making a decision of who wins the bid for this or that procurement.
Right.
The lowest price that meets the criteria always wins. So it's all been done automatically. You just submit in your bids. They're being automatically evaluated, and whoever offers the same quality for the lower price wins.
Super. Olga, I just want to ask you a little bit about the judicial regime currently in Ukraine and the challenges within that regime for proper or effective anti-corruption. For example, you may have a lot of lawyers, but are they committed to it? Are they trained properly for it? I mean, we have some young lawyers or lawyers to be in this room. If these people were in Ukraine, sort of what barriers or challenges would they be facing? And that's at the lawyer level. Then you've got the judges. So are the judges sufficiently trained or experienced or committed enough to the cause?
If we're talking about judicial sector in Ukraine, it's a low trust to this area in Ukraine, unfortunately. Maybe people have seen some reasons for that, right? Because usually you have to have reasons for something. If we're talking about lawyers, unfortunately, due to war, many lawyers stopped practicing. It's because they were joining,
They joined the military.
Yes. At the same time, the process slowed down due to Russian invasion of Ukraine. So basically, on a first level trial courts, all hearings right now slow down, just because there is no termination for something, right? So yeah, but what I would say about lawyers in Ukraine, I have seen a lot of professionals in Ukraine, professional lawyers. Sometimes they usually struggle how to deal with the system because legislation is not perfect, right? But I would say from a lawyer perspective, just because I'm a lawyer and I'm respectful to my colleagues, they have enough knowledge and professional skills to deal with Ukrainian system. How they do and how they deal, in which way, I mean, it's their own perspective, how to do that. From judges' side, right? If we're talking about independent judiciary from who? We have to secure it, right? Independent judiciary must be from external factors like political inflation. At the same time, from party inflation inside a trial. So during court hearing, there will be always a person who initiate corrupt practices. How we can prevent that? What kind of measures we can use in this case to prevent? But based on my experience, what I seen, it was different, I would say. But judges in Ukraine also have enough skills and enough knowledge to do a fair trial. How it's going on in each particular case, we need to look and to this particular case. And at first to make decisions or say that there is corruption was used to make particular decision, we have to see documents and we have to know all details about case. But in generally, there is a professionals, judges and the lawyers. But how they deal with the system sometimes just because the system is not perfect. We need to take a look at particular case. If we're talking about corruption in the judicial area in Ukraine, the most corruption on the first level. On the second and the third level is more hidden or there is no corruption. Ukraine actually tried to reform judicial sector after 2014. They reorganized Supreme Court. But the result of this reform, we can see a case which came up last year with the head of Supreme Court who took a bribe.
Oh, the head of the Supreme Court
Yes.
took a bribe,
Yes.
a big bribe?
Yeah, a huge bribe. I don't remember which amount it was, but yeah, the result of this reform. Ukraine right now is in second stage to try to make these reforms. But still, I think it will take time, given systemic corruption in this area. We usually need to take time to understand what kind of measure worked out, what kind of measure didn't work out. But from a professional perspective, I would say that I have seen so many professional lawyers and I have seen so many professional judges.
So since the invasion, then, if we could sort of move one step past that, since the invasion, has anti-corruption efforts have increased, or the success rate has increased, or corruption has decreased?
I think that in this point, the better say that anti-corruptions continue to take place since the first positive point. About the second point, maybe everyone heard about CPI index, corruption perception index. Ukraine actually last year—
That's a Transparency International.
Yeah,
index.
last year increased by 3 points, right? And over the 10 years increased, like if I'm not mistaken, by 11 points, right?
By 7. Since
I saw-
2014, from 26.
So getting better.
Yeah, it's getting better, but we don't need to forget that it's a lot of discussions around how to measure corruption, right? At the same time, if we're talking about CPIs, it usually covers public sector and doesn't cover private sector and anti-money laundering. At the same time, there is also data. During my research, I discovered justice, a rule of law index, which actually shows absence of corruption in Ukraine since, like, you can see a difference. So basically, unfortunately, 2014, from 2015, sorry, until 2023, Ukraine is sliding down in its rating of absence of corruption. In 2024, Ukraine increased it's like by few points, but I'm like, yeah. So we need to understand like what actually we have a result in anti-corruption. At first, as Alexander mentioned, mainly attention in the public sector, right? So CPI actually shows that all measures which were taken in place have results, right? But if we're talking about private sectors, what kind of measures we can use? This rule of law index showed that, unfortunately, in criteria of absence corruption, Ukraine since 2014 till 2023 slowing down in its ranking. So,
okay, and all of this in a country that's only 33 years old.
yes, I agree.
Okay, so I think that these expectations that we have here in Canada or in the US or over in Europe, sometimes they're a little unrealistic. I think particularly for a country that is not only 33 years old, sort of different from, say, some of the countries that weren't necessarily under Soviet rule for the same length of time, like Estonia and others that we were talking about earlier. So a country like Ukraine that has had such a long history of without a market economy, without, I mean, I can't even imagine what the judicial regime was like in Soviet times. So, and that we'll save that for another discussion. So all of these sort of massive societal changes that had to take place and that people had to be confronted with overnight. Oh, now suddenly we have a market economy. Oh, now suddenly we have a fair justice system. And so, I would say the expectations we have here in the West have to be tempered with some knowledge of Ukraine's actual situation and history, which is why we're here today to learn a little bit more about that. Most of what we've been talking about in the last few minutes is sort of been colored by the elephant in the room, which is the Russian invasion. And we did talk about perception, the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. There's a lot of other perceptions that the world has about, and certainly here in Canada, that has about Ukraine, what it's actually like, what it's like to live there, what the government is like, what President Zelensky is doing, the games that he has to, or the issues that he has to balance, all the meddling from foreign powers. But I'd like to just address the elephant in the room, which is the Russian invasion. And some of you may have heard that there was an election recently in the United States. And during the campaign, a lot of information, a lot of statements were made about Ukraine and what we're going to do with Ukraine if I'm elected, or what Ukraine should have done. In your own personal opinion, we're just going to digress a little bit from the subject of anti-corruption, because I can't think of two better people to talk about this subject with. What were the events or the motivations leading up to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia? I mean, there's some of these perceptions are that it was somehow Ukraine's fault. And when I hear things like that, I think we should dig a little bit deeper on that. So just from your own personal standpoints, what happened?
I think Russia just like had so strong interest in Ukraine to do corrupt practices, right? And the perspective of losing this field for some practices, maybe for Russia it would be like, good in a perspective. At the same time, I also have heard that it's Ukrainian fault that Russia invaded. How it can be Ukrainian fault, from my perspective, I don't understand. Ukraine is an independent country. Ukraine can choose its own way, right? And to not come to Russia and ask what we should do, to stay with Russia or go to the European Union, right? And unfortunately, we have such type of neighbor, right? Russia and Ukraine, like, kind of between European Union, right, and Russia. And that's why it also will be like some discussion, actually Ukraine with whom, with Russia or with the European Union, right? But I think from my perspective, Russia had a really strong, and have maybe has a strong interest in Ukraine to do some shady stuff, right? So that's why they decided that perspective of losing this opportunity, it will not be good for Russia. At the same time, I don't know what's going on in Putin's head, I would say, right? Because he thinks that Russia and Ukraine is like all connected nations or one nation. But, time has, like, things has changed over the time. Ukraine, gained independence in 1991. I think Russia need to let Ukraine to do what Ukraine wants to do. So that's why my perspective.
Okay, Alex?
Yeah, I will probably add 2 points here. First of all, in my mind, we need to think about how Russia generally perceived the collapse of Soviet Union, and it was perceived. As a, they let Baltic countries go. They let Poland go and join the West. But the rest, they treated as their own playground and within their own sphere of influence. And I think we already saw something like what's happening in Ukraine earlier, back in 2008, when Georgia, under the rule of Saakashvili, embarked on reforms, comprehensive reforms. What Russians did, they invaded. They invaded. It was not like a full-scale invasion, but they took significant portion of the territory. They invaded. Now, what is the government in Georgia? They had elections 2 weeks ago. It's pro-Russian government. And significant portion of that is because people are afraid of the fact that if they do not choose pro-Russian government, but choose pro-European one, they're going to be invaded like Ukraine. And looking at their geography, they do not have any border with the Western countries. So it makes sense for them to be invaded because it's access to Black Sea, then it's Turkey, Armenia, Russia. That's it. They don't have even border with Poland, like at least Ukraine has, like Romania, Poland, other countries where you can get this supply. In Ukraine, it was pretty much the same. For a long time, I felt like Russia was pretty confident in being able to keep Ukraine within its sphere of influence by buying off politicians. And that was very visible during Yanukovych's period of time. because that's when the turn happened. Like from suddenly we were all talking about European future, joining this association agreement. And then in the very last moment, the guy just says, no, we are not signing that agreement. We will instead take loans from Russia, which were later being considered by courts actually as a bribe, but that's an entirely separate story. And they managed to keep it within the sphere of influence. So once that pro-Russian government was toppled in 2014, that's when there was the first invasion, small invasion like in Georgia. And then there was a lot of back and forth going for the next 5 years. And I think a lot of hope was connected with the 2019 elections. Because my feeling is that it's just a guess, that Putin hoped that Zelensky was heavily running on the campaign that I will come to power and we will stop the war. I will talk to Putin, we will stop the war will not continue. And he was, I would not be afraid to say the word arrogant, to the extent that he was actually, during his election campaign, accusing the current government, Poroshenko's government, and running on the platform saying that the only reason why the war continues is because there are some people in Ukrainian government who benefit from it. And I think there was a strong belief in Russia that, well, we can take Ukraine back once this guy gets elected, or whoever gets elected. But once he actually came to power, that's when he realized that, well, no, it's not like Putin who wants to make any peace deal with Ukraine. They actually are not interested in that. So he turned to increase cooperation with the EU and with the West generally. And that's when I feel like Putin got this final understanding, like, well, no, Ukraine isn't making a turn back to Russia. It's actually breaking off this influence and heading west. If we don't invade right now, who knows where the country will be in 5 years? Because while you are still not a part of the EU, while you are still like way far from NATO, there is no one to protect, and there is a good opportunity for us to jump in and take back the control. And I felt that there was a severe miscalculation in the first days of war, when they actually thought that there will be no resistance. That's why you can see all these troops in the first day actually marching on highways towards Kiev. Like not really engaging in a lot of combat. There was combat in certain areas, right, where they were trying to basically topple the government right away and put their puppet. But they thought that there will be no resistance in other places. They did not expect it.
And you were there the day they invaded, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And what was the general feeling in the public? Like, is this really happening?
Yeah, I remember the day I used to live on the 7th floor, and I looked in the window and people just escaping, and it's like, it was chaotic. No one didn't understand what's gonna happen and what so, no.
And the population of Ukraine on that day was?
There is a different data, but definitely it was much more than now. It's
Yeah,
like,
so a lot of people have left.
36 million
Yeah.
approximately.
It was 36 million
data shows
More or
that flat around 8 million people from Ukraine since.
have left.
Yeah.
And in that 8 million, probably a lot of very qualified anti-corruption fighters, lawyers, judges, medical practitioners,
Yeah.
just a whole professional class has left.
Yeah, many of them came back to Ukraine, but living in an environment that you don't know what day will bring, or night will bring, morning will bring, it's kind of stressful. And can you imagine, usually they launches attack at night, you don't sleep because you have opponents like constant alarms, and in the morning you come like to work, you're able to do your job properly, not always. Right, you getting tired of this, so it's kind of challenging right now for people who live in Ukraine to have their daily life. Don't say that about safety, right? So, yeah.
So with so much government money going into the war effort, is there enough money left over to pay people like federal judges and federal prosecutors? I mean, is it, or are they earning
I have
a
heard,
pittance.
what I have heard is some salaries for some civil servants were cut. But in general, I didn't check the data regarding the judge's salary, you know. So, but yeah,
They're constitutionally protected. You
Oh,
cannot,
they're constitutionally protected.
Yeah.
All right,
you
okay,
cannot cut down on that.
okay, fair enough.
When it comes to judges, there was there were attempts. There was a decision on Constitutional Court back in I think 2020 about that. So it's
Mhm. And what does Canada help to fund in Ukraine?
they have some regarding judges, right? Initiative.
Canada participates in many things, including international technical assistance projects to help bring reforms and implement reforms. So,
We help train the military, I know that.
well, yeah, but it's
But in
on
terms of-
military track
Yeah.
is a separate
Yeah,
one, I
yeah.
would say. Obviously, there is a lot of there, but even in terms of expertise, yes, it's Canada is participating.
Okay. So since the invasion then, the bureaucratic structure hasn't broken down. Things still get done, life goes on,
Yeah, a bit slower.
a little bit slower. And so in terms of the fight with anti-corruption, what do you see over the next couple of years? I mean, I won't ask you to sort of predict which way the war is going to go, but in terms of the actual direction of anti-corruption efforts, they'll continue to move forward, they'll continue to be funded?
I think, yeah, it will continue to move forward and be funded. At the same time, I think that after like couple years, actually like anti-corruption measures were implemented during last 10 years will show more results, effective results in the corruption prevention. But of course, given a fact that we still have ongoing war and we don't know when it will be finished, right? We can't understand how many resources we need for that and how long it will take actually to show these results.
Right.
I would say that in terms of anti-corruption efforts, they just skyrocketed anti-corruption efforts during the wartime. Specifically because if previously you could see some political resistance from the high level and the willingness to engage in long discussions, okay, whether we need or don't need to implement this or that policy, right now there is very little resistance to that.
Yeah, I bet.
So pretty much everything is being implemented very fast. And I absolutely agree with Olga. We will see more convictions. I think now the focus is on mainstreaming anti-corruption efforts in each sector of national economy. And embedding these guarantees that will eliminate or prevent, or at least limit corrupt practices in every single area. So that's where a lot of efforts are. When it comes to convictions and adjudications, now many more cases are already in trial. So we just cannot speed them up beyond the extent that the legislation allows. I mean, it's still a due process and you still need to deliver a high quality trial because a lot of attention is being paid and a lot is at stake. A lot is actually in stake. You try to circumvent, any procedural rule, and there will be always appeals, and that will just bring you in a loop of constant appeals, and then go into European Court of Human Rights and all of that. And that's not
Right. Okay.
what we want.
So we have just a few minutes left. I'd like to ask anybody here in the audience. Nicole, have we received any questions from the listening audience? No, is there anybody here who would like to ask a question of our panelists today? Fire away.
Yeah, thanks for the insightful discussion. I really enjoyed listening to it. My name is James Kurtuluş. I'm a senior scholar here at Allard. And my question is about the future of the fight against corruption in Ukraine. So we know that making an anti-corruption court operational requires more than just adopting legislation. In Slovakia, for example, a specialized anti-corruption court was established following public outcry triggered by the murder of a journalist investigating government corruption. But Slovakia seems to lose its fight against corruption, at least to my understanding, from the news, mainly because Prime Minister Robert Fico is taking steps to dismantle institutions fighting against corruption. In fact, Slovak government hasn't only given up the fight against corruption, but it's actually directly contributing to the creating ideal conditions that's suitable for corruption. So my question is, do you think Ukraine has, Ukraine is likely to suffer the same fate in the future, especially given the challenges posed by the war and the shortages of resources? Or do you believe that you have sufficient protections that will prevent such steps being taken in the future by current or future politicians?
Great question. Thank you.
I would be short. I think to answer this question, we have to consider like a couple factors, right? We don't know who will be next president. The main point to prevent corruption is political will. We never predict there will be a political will with the next government, right? With the next president or no. Other point, what I would say that Ukraine has done a lot in anti-corruption, and to give up, I think it will be the last point to do, But there's a Ukrainian anti-corruption system already shows result, and I'm sure that it will continue to show positive result in corruption prevention.
Several thoughts on this matter. First of all, I do not think that there will be any government in Ukraine that will not run an anti-corruption platform. According to any public survey that you can open right now and see the perception of threats in the country, the war is the threat to national security number one. And when you ask people what they name as number two, is corruption. We need to fight, fight, fight. Unfortunate portion here is that, if I'm understanding your question correctly, the concern is with, say, Slovakia has to do with institutions. And in my mind, Ukrainians also tend to fall in this trap, willing to have rough and ready solutions rather than investing in institution building and having the systems that are in place. And it's a young country, the same way as Slovakia. And the respect for institutions and understanding how institutions shape our daily life, in my mind, is still not there yet. But there is no way that somebody will be able to win any elections without running an anti-corruption campaign. Hopefully, it will transform just from expectation of putting more people in prison to something larger than that. Another portion that I think is important here, what makes the difference between Ukraine and Slovakia, is that Slovakia joined the EU earlier. And back in the day when Slovakia did, the anti-corruption part of criteria or requirements that the Commission was putting in front of the candidate states was way lower. So there is a good book actually exploring what was happening in 1990s, early 2000s, this new wave of expansion and how the EU was putting in place anti-corruption requirements. And if you compare that, what they asked for from that candidate states back then and what they asked from a new candidate states, it's like a huge difference. It's also entirely different story that that on the EU side there is another problem. EU has a lot of tools to influence countries when they are in the accession stage. But once they actually do join the Union, it's not much that the Union can require from them. Now there is a new anti-corruption directive by Commission and Parliament that is being discussed. I think it was announced last May 2023 or something like that. So it's being discussed, it will be implemented and put in place. But yeah, I think the story of Ukraine looks slightly brighter than the story of Slovakia in terms of fight against corruption, but I wouldn't say that the backlash isn't possible.
And hopefully brighter in terms of the safety of investigative journalists. Obviously, this poor fellow in Slovakia didn't quite have the same the same privilege. But you two mentioned earlier, and we're going to wrap this up momentarily, but generally the press in Ukraine is free, and investigative journalists play a very fundamental role in exposing corruption there. We will not discuss this any further. We can leave this for another day. This was the first in a series, as Joe had mentioned at the outset, in a series of seminars that we want to put on here through the Anti-Corruption Law Program on literally educating our audience about Ukraine, about its anti-corruption efforts, where they've been and where they're going. And in light of the recent US election, that really throws a lot of things up into the air. With a new administration coming in January, they have their own views, very strong views about Ukraine and the war, and we really don't know how that's all going to pan out. So hopefully by the time of our next seminar, we will have some more answers and some more clarity on literally the future of Ukraine and the future of its anti-corruption efforts. So on behalf of Joe Weiler and the great Carol Liao, who's been so instrumental in helping us to put on these webinars over the last several years. Nicole Suderman, thank you so much for your technical assistance, and thank you to our studio audience here today. And thank you so much to Alex Komarov and Olga Chernobyl for really helping to shed so much light on a topic that for us here in Canada, and literally probably for a lot of you out there watching on the internet, is a topic that we just don't know enough about. We think we do because we watch CNN or we watch something else. Oh yeah, I know a lot about Ukraine. We actually really don't. And I've learned an incredible amount here today. I presume that everybody in this room has learned a great deal about Ukraine as well. So thank you so much for your insight, your observations. They're greatly valued, and I very much look forward to continuing this conversation in a future seminar. And to all of you, there will be a recording of this event made available shortly on the Center for Business Law website, which is through the Peter A. Allard School of Law website as well, and also on the Anti-Corruption Law Program LinkedIn page. So I wish you all a pleasant good day, and thank you so much for attending. So long.